I'm here with Achilios. Once again, at an interesting time. We've had your colleagues, or former colleagues, I guess, in Sideshow before, but we also had Reinforce last time. In these times, I always have to ask the question, it seems. I guess let's start off heavy and then
let's just get the elephant in the room out of the way.
Right. So, what is your current employment status with the Overwatch League?
Undetermined, I guess, is the easiest way to kind of get it out. Things are still ongoing, and we'll see where they lead. Otherwise, I'm still working and doing Valorant out here, as well as any other opportunities that come up and whatnot. That I guess that's the short, sweet way to put it, I suppose. So, we'll see what happens.
Right. Now, Valorant is a good keyword, and I was interested because I think Overwatch fans might not be aware, but you've been doing a ton of Valorant content over the last couple of months, really using the off-season.
There's so much of it to use. I got to do something with it.
Yeah, for sure. The thing is, when we talked to Reinforce and Sideshow, they said as analytical minds, it is really challenging to just keep on top of two games. And I was interested, what the narrative from a play-by-play cast is, because these guys then have these sentences, if I was just hosting, or if I was just doing play-by-play, or I was just doing that and that, it would all be so easy. Okay, I'm misrepresenting a little bit what they're saying, but in theory, you don't need to hyper-analyze, but you need to be aware of the narratives that are going on in both scenes, right? In order to tell the story on the go. So how challenging is it to keep up with two esports at once, and how do you do it?
It can be challenging. I think it does especially kind of come down to which two esports you're doing, because obviously certain ones have a lot more depth to them. All of them have storylines, and for play-by-play, you don't need to hyper analyze, but there's always those storylines that you need to be aware of. So I think that going between two games, those are really the things that you want to keep in mind, as well as just the general game knowledge and whatnot. So you want to know who the best teams are, who is on all of these teams, what is their past, what teams have they played on before, what are the roster changes that have happened, what are the rivalries that have developed. Those are all things that you want to be able to track while you're doing multiple esports. I think for the majority of my career, I would say I've probably been doing two games, so I'm very used to it, I suppose. My years with Overwatch League in 2019, 2020, those were, I guess, the kind of the breaks where I wasn't doing multiple titles, but my lead up into joining Overwatch League, I was casting League of Legends, and then there was a couple days of PUBG that were in there, so I was doing up to 3 titles at a given time. There's always some stray one-off tournaments. You get a Chinese hosted event like WCG, and they ask you to go cast some other random title and whatnot. So sometimes you kind of sprinkle these other little things in, but they're never that huge of a focus, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, widely, I would agree that it does come with its innate difficulties. There's a lot to keep tabs on. I think that as a play-by-play, obviously, you still want to be able to do a certain level of analysis. You don't need to be able to do the deep dive, telestration, this is how they set up this play type stuff. But I've filled on analyst desks for Overwatch League in the past. I've been on the analyst desk for Valorant in both the first Masters event at Reykjavik, as well as at Champions. So it does come with a good amount of knowledge that you want to have as a play-by-play. So unfortunately, we don't get to just be the yelly guy who doesn't need to know anything. He's oh, you shot him in the head, and that's basically it. And then you just transition to the other title, and then you're oh, he shot him in the head. There is a lot to keep tabs on. You don't want to just be perceived as the dumb play-by-play who doesn't understand the game, and then lean heavily on your analyst, because it also makes it way more difficult for your analyst if they need to cover every little bit of detail as far as what's going on in a game. Then that makes their job much more stressful, especially if they are also doing multiple esports titles. So the more that you know and the more burden you can put on yourself, obviously it kind of lessens that for your co-caster.
Right. Now, is every time you come back to Overwatch League, and of course we're known for our long off seasons, does it feel like riding a bike, or do you have to ease into it? Is there some anxiety every time you get into your first game again?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a little bit of anxiety. I've been casting for about 10 years now, and not necessarily in a professional capacity, but that's when I kind of started, going on 11 years now, I guess. But there's always a little bit of anxiety. Like, I'll get ready to go on to like a big broadcast or whatever. It's the first day back of a season, like the first day back at Valorant. My heart started pounding a little bit, but I think that's a good thing. Um, in the past, I always like growing up, I always did community theater and whatnot, and I initially had hated it, and then I ended up falling in love with it, and pursued acting for a period of time. And right before I would go on stage, I'm standing right off the side. The audience just can barely not see me. I'm getting ready to pull that curtain open so that I can walk out onto the stage. I would always have my heartbeat pounding, and I always found that those are the times where I would give a performance that I was really happy with. So I've always kind of associated that nervousness with, s- I guess, keeping myself like from being complacent and always making sure that I'm giving it my all. Um, so for like Overwatch League, while it is still, very familiar, I'd say like it is a bit like riding a bike. Um, I still do have that nervousness because things do change. Obviously we're having there's going to be like a massive overhaul. 5v5. Like like how is this going to go? Like I have
Yeah.
no idea. So like if I'm going to be casting it, like there's still going to be that nervousness because even though I know all of these characters, I know their kids, I know what they do, I know these teams, these players, their past, what they've been playing in the past, like I don't know what the meta is going to look like. There's always going to be these changes coming into it where it's like, how do things shake up? What is the power balance like? Who are going to be the players that pop off? Do we still just have the same people who are going to be, dominant in their role, or do new people come up and overtake them? There's always a lot to be considering and be worried about. So, you can jump on the bike, but the chain might have come off a little bit, and you have to do a little bit of repair before you're really ready to ride. So we'll see what ends up happening. But I think it's always good to have some level of distress before you start a broadcast. Because like I said, you don't want to be complacent. You don't want to be like, yeah, I got this. Because if you always think that you're going to do a good job when you go into something, you're not necessarily going to improve. Even if you're already doing something right, there's always room for improvement to push yourself to become better. So I like to try to avoid that.
Right. What is the type of preparation that you usually do? Is it just like in terms of specifically game knowledge? So let's say, do you sit down and try to grind VODs of like maybe let's say the contender seasons that are happening beforehand? Maybe there was a preseason event and you can look at these, or do you talk to coaches? Do you ask to visit scrims? Do you ask to talk to the players? What's your way of preparing there?
Um, Typically, I just kind of look over the teams. Obviously, like the known quantities, I don't have to dive into too much unless there's people who are like undergoing some kind of role swap. So like if I'm gonna be studying Philly Fusion, like I'm not looking at Carpe. Like I don't need to look into him
Yeah.
and figure out what's going on with Carpe. I
Yeah.
know exactly what Carpe is going to be doing. But for other teams, especially when you do have those contenders players coming up, um, I like to take a deep look at them. What are the teams that they've been on in the past? How have they performed? Like what's the highest ranking that they've been able to achieve while they're playing in contenders and whatnot? Is this a player that's coming off of a first place team? And we expect that they're going to be really good at the gate, or is this somebody who's coming off of like a team that was kind of near the bottom, maybe middle of the pack in contenders, but was never really able to push out, that individually looked really good? Like, is this our next Fleta? Or when we had Bazzi in the Overwatch League, is it like him? Because when he was on seven, back in Overwatch contenders season one, they placed in like eighth place or something. But then he was still individually a really good player. So it's like, I want to look for those details. I'm not much of a VOD watcher myself. I'd say for like really big events, at least not for Overwatch, I guess, since it all is kind of like one league. Um, like I'll catch a little bit of like the NA games before I go to bed. Typically, if I'm doing an Overwatch season, I'll stay up late. I'll watch the first match, and then I go to sleep, and then I just kind of look at the results. If I hear that, if I see like some discussion on something really crazy that happened, like I'll go back and watch the VOD. But in getting prepared, that's not necessarily something that I do unless there's multiple regions involved. So like a game like Valorant, like going into Champions, just watching obviously like NA, EMEA, there's Japan, you've got APAC, all of these teams from different places because each region will have its own individual play styles, and there's not necessarily like a shared meta across there. We see that a little bit in Overwatch in the past, where we were doing a lot more like ball compositions. Like Shanghai was really piloting that and crushing, and NA didn't really seem super prepared for it, and they couldn't hold up to it when it came down to the tournament play. So like you get a little bit of differing metas, but um, I think for the most part in Overwatch, especially, like it's a bit more uniform across the regions. But I don't know. I just want to know who I'm talking about. I guess I know I'm rambling on about this, but I mostly want to know like who I'm talking about, what they've done in the past, and what I can kind of expect from them coming into the season. And then otherwise, I just kind of let it play out in front of my eyes and call it as I see it.
Right. I mean, considering we're about to get an entirely new game, there's not too much preparation to be done or too much VODs to grind, I suppose, right?
Yeah, that's the other thing is like I just don't really know what's gonna happen until it's in front of me. It's the game state, myself casting. It's just a big question of like what is gonna occur, and I just kind of have to wait and see how it all plays out.
Right. Now, I suppose like there's a certain rhythm to casting Overwatch. Like if you were to compare it to, let's say, CS, where there's very clear rounds, I would say in Overwatch it's certainly like an ebb and flow of hype, sort of like as the team fights come in. Maybe the team fights with ults are a little bit more hype as well. Do you think anything about the game as to how you will have to cast it will change due to the 5v5? Do you think it will be a little bit more skirmishy, like maybe more fights happening all the time, maybe less like giant peaks where 5v5 actually clash, or is it just the way how Overwatch is played generally?
I think that I mean, obviously, innately, like something will change as far as the flow is concerned, but I'm still expecting a very similar product and a very similar outcome, I suppose, with how these fights are going to occur and what the cast is overall going to sound like. I don't think that the loss of two players on either side is, or one player on either side, is going to really cut down on the action too much. So I think that widely we can kind of expect it to be a bit similar to what we saw in 6v6. Obviously, it adds a lot more importance when somebody gets picked off now because that is a fifth of your team that has been eliminated. So it's that much more difficult to fight back compared to if you lose a sixth. So I think that it will add a bit more emphasis when somebody does get picked off or when somebody's popping off and like really crushing people. Because now getting like 2 kills it's so much, it means so much more compared to what it did necessarily in Overwatch 1. So I think that basically we will, as commentators, look to figure out like what is what are now like the what is the priority list for what the most important thing to talk about is. I think that will have to be reassessed because you're constantly firing in your brain, figuring out like what needs to be discussed in this moment right now. What is priority number one? And I think that will get shuffled around a little bit. Um, but widely, I think that what the viewer will hear is going to be very similar to Overwatch 1. I think that it's still going to be a very, consistent action, poking and prodding, maybe a little bit more than some all-in plays. But there's constantly going to be skirmishing going on. I think that we can expect that the action is not going to take a step back too much.
Right. Have you ever had like talks with other play-by-plays how they sort of like structure every single engagement? Because theoretically there's like a pre-fight setup and that needs a certain tone, and then you get into like maybe they're poking out, or maybe a pick happens, or maybe they just like all on clash, which is a little bit different depending on the meta. I imagine less pickoffs in goats, for instance, than in widow metas. And then you get into a stage, and one thing I always found to be incredibly hard is, let's say a team gets 3 picks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's 6v3. Statistically speaking, 98% of the time, you're now safe to just like talk about the next fight or what the win conditions there or whatever. In those 2% of cases where you start talking about whatever else should be happening in the next fight, where that one player just makes a play and they come back, you look like you kind of misread the situation, even though you just played the numbers, right? Like, how do you avoid that as a caster in that situation?
I mean, I don't think it necessarily needs to be avoided. I think that if your focus is just on saying trying to basically be like a galaxy brain, I guess, and understand like everything that's about to happen. Um, I think you're gonna cause yourself to trip up more than if you just kind of go with the natural flow of the game. It's totally fine to make that call and be incorrect. I think it actually adds to a moment a little bit more so. Um, and it really emphasizes how insane the comeback play is or the clutch play is when you're like ready to move on to a topic and then like for me, it basically, if I think that the fight is kind of done and dusted, I might hand it off to Avril to start doing his analysis, talk about that last, how that last fight went down, what he expects from the next one, like what the setup needs to be. And if we start seeing somebody kind of clutch and come back into it, like I'm not going to just interrupt him necessarily. But I'll be like, wait, and like kind of add to that, and then he throws it to me, and then we go into it, and then you start talking about like how this miraculous play is going off, and it just really gives it that instant shift in the action that so we match that tonally with what people are seeing on screen. We shift back and it's like, oh my god, actually he's going to do this, and it really adds to just how incredible it is, like that this person's able to come up with that kind of clutch play. Like you think about some of the biggest clutches that have ever occurred, like Fleta at the end of King's Row swapping to the Widowmaker. Oh god, my brain is not functioning today. But yeah, I mean, just plays like that, like okay. Yes, there we go. EQO, that's where I was trying to go. Yeah, EQO's clutch, like those kinds of things, like you cannot expect that that's going to happen. Like you should always be prepared for it, but sometimes if you're like, well, he's clutched before, maybe he's going to do it again, and then they just die. It's like, if you're trying to do that every time, it's like you're actually putting more pressure on the player, and the audience might be thinking that the player isn't playing up to snuff rather than what it is, which is that they're not clutching a nearly impossible situation, which is what you expect. So you should basically always tell people what you expect, and then when you are surprised by what happens, I think it just adds to the moment so much.
Right. Now, okay, this is a two-part question.
Sorry,
just because.
Sorry, I forgot.
Yeah, no problem there. I think you will understand. Now, you just brought me to like a situation, and I think when you watch Overwatch on LAN, you realize that it's hard. It's a hard game for an audience to read. I remember like watching, being like at, I think it was Atlantic Showdown, and we had goats, and someone made a Reinhardt play where they just got a huge shatter, 4-man shatter, but the opposing Lucio was around the corner and could beat the shatter. Now, to the audience, it sort of feels like, oh wow, huge shatter happened. This wins the fight. Lucio beats, oh, this is kind of confusing. It now doesn't end the fight. Of course, we know now that the beat has to have been forced by the shatter. It's no longer there for graph and whatnot. And so, like, this was a huge play. We should be celebrating it, but the payoff will be coming later, right? Is it hard to sort of like carry that energy of the audience? Because it feels like they've been debated for a while, but they really haven't been, right?
No, I mean, like you want to call those moments for what it is, but you also want to be real about it. So like if they use the shadow to bait the sound barrier so that they can just set up a graph play or whatever. There's no maybe there's no like Zenyatta or and whatnot that can just use a trance and like keeps everybody alive through it. So like they know now, like you're basically the teams are playing chess at that point and they're setting up to get into a checkmate position. You just kind of have to call that. Like, yeah, is it a huge shatter? Yeah, it's amazing. But what's even bigger is that now the sound barrier is gone, and that's not necessarily like as a play-by-play my job to go into detail and break down the flow chart of like how the rest of this is going to be. That's why it's great to have like the great analysts that I've been able to work alongside, whether it's Wolf or Avril. I can trust that if I make the call on the shatter, I know that they're going to come in and be like, and now because they got the sound barrier out, they've got the graviton surges coming up in 6%. So for the next fight, blah, 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 blah. Like they're going to just reset and they're going to come in here, catch as many people as they can, and then they're going to wipe the floor with them. Like I know that they're going to pick up on that narrative. They know the flow chart just like I know the flow chart. So we are just going to align and tell the audience like what's going on. So you get to be excited about the big play, and then you get the analyst who comes in, pushes up the glasses, like actually though, like, this is now the thing that comes in. Like, yeah, the sound barrier is really cool, but now they don't have a way to survive the graph. So they can set up that play, and then if the team does survive the graviton surge, it's even more crazy. You go back to that, just kind of like having your expectations of how this is going to play out being subverted, and you get to make that hype. Otherwise, you get to make the grav, like, oh my god, it catches all six of them, like they just wipe the floor with them, boom, and you get to maintain that energy for the audience.
Speaking of energy, I guess the last 2 years have been sort of challenging in that always feel like, or think of play-by-play casters as just like these lions that have now been caged up by not being let out on the audience, just to like feed on the energy of the moment and just like really let it roar, right? It's like, and
Yeah.
just therefore also elevating the experience for everyone watching at home, because as you're energized, your cast transforms into something else. Has it been challenging for you to remote cast?
Oh yeah, I hate it. I like there's like three stages, and it's remote casting at the one end, and then you've got obviously like casting with an audience at the other end, and then there's just being in a studio with no audience in the middle. And I have had to experience the first two, especially quite a bit. For Valorant, like I have been in a studio last year. We were in this really massive one, but we were in a bit of a side room. Now we're back in the old OGN studio doing Valorant. So it's like amazing to kind of be there. It feels like a bit of a homecoming. And while we haven't had an audience yet, um, I know that we are going to have one come tomorrow. I don't know when this is going to be going out, but like once our playoffs start, like we're going to have an audience, and that's going to be my first time casting with an audience in the room in a considerable amount of time, and I just cannot wait to have that experience again. Um, like casting from home is convenient because I can roll out of bed, I can do a mic check, shower in between, and then sit back down, 10 minutes before the games get started, talk with that for a little bit, go over what we want to say as far as like the storylines and whatnot are concerned. That's fine for convenience, but I don't want to be convenience. Like I said, like I prefer having that stress at the beginning of a broadcast. And that's not really something that comes with being in my house. This is a place of comfort. So you you really do lose that urgency, that feeling of importance for a series because you don't have that audience kind of yelling at you. Being back in the studio helps a bit because it's like, it's not home. I'm in a different space. Like that comfort is taken away from you. But when you have the audience thrown at you, you just feed off of them. Like even though my voice is not going to be going out to that crowd during like the Valorant playoffs, like the fact that they are there in the room, I'm going to be hearing their reactions. I'm going to be just feeling that rumbling that comes from all of the crowd noise and whatnot. Like it adds such a nice stroke of tension um, for me that I can play off of and I could feed off of that energy. You do need to be careful though. You can get drunk on the audience energy. Like you can go too far. You need to temper it because if you're going to get it really excited and start yelling every single time the audience gets loud, it's not necessarily going to jive up with what's happening on the screen. Like it could be that the audience really, really loves the Shanghai Dragons, and Shanghai is playing against the LA Valiant. Let's just
Yeah.
for last year as an example. Like that is not a series that is going to be super exciting unless Valiant does something crazy, but they're not gonna. So like
Yeah.
if you just kind of get drunk off the audience power, like their energy, like maybe you're going to be overhyping this stuff, and it's like, well, it's also kind of just fate wiping the floor with everybody.
Yes.
He's just playing wrecking ball, he's diving backline, everybody's just getting destroyed. Like it's what we expected. You still want to be like excited and not casting in like a bored fashion, but you don't want to overhype. So you got to be wary about that when there's an audience involved.
Right. Now, of course, if you're constantly screaming, there's also another threat,
Yeah.
I guess. I wonder a little bit about the mechanics of play-by-play, and especially like what kind of practice one would have to do. For instance, let's say, do you need to
Mm.
do any vocal work? Do you do any breathing technique so you have breath left at the end of the big play and you're not just like gasping for air? And
Yeah.
also, like, how do you maintain your vocal cords during like a final series? And is that even possible at a certain point of length of the series, I suppose?
It's it's very possible. A lot of play-by-plays, I'd say, would tell you like, "Oh, man, game 5, I'm gonna destroy my voice." I'm like, "You don't need to do that,
Mm.
and you shouldn't do that." There's so many complications that can come up from people destroying their vocal cords. Um, like especially when I was getting started, I definitely I think was overcompensating and pushing out way more energy, yelling a lot more than I really needed to. And also just doing it improperly. Like I said, like I have a background in community in theater and acting and whatnot. I studied acting in high school. I went to like a vocational technical school. So we kind of had like almost like college majors and I was in the drama department. Um and through all of that, like I learned like breathing patterns, like how to, like just kind of naturally and like almost reflexively learning, I guess, of like when to take in a breath so that it's not going to interrupt your flow and you're not going to run out of air. It's something that's obviously super important when you're singing and also doing like a really, really long fight that isn't ending. Um, so learning that is really important, but also I'd say like the number one thing that people need to learn is how to project. Speak from your diaphragm. Don't speak from your throat. Because if you are getting excited and you're yelling and all of it is coming from right here, you are going to lose your voice so quickly. There's a lot of casters out there. You listen to them casting like a final series, but it's it ends up being 5 games, but by game three they're starting to have their voices waver and you can hear like the cracks coming through and whatnot. And when that happens, you damage your vocal cords. That can be permanent damage. It can change the way that you sound. It can change your range, the longevity for how long you can like hold and like say something. Um, it can affect a lot, and it could also, lead you to develop, like, polyps. Like, I know people who have developed polyps on their vocal cords, and they have to have surgery to remove them, and that's if that happens, you can't speak for a month. That is a month where you cannot do your job. So even if the season's over, uh, like if there's any other work that you want to pick up, you can't do it. If you want to play video games and pop off in Discord with your friends or whatever and have a good time, you can't do that because you cannot speak above a whisper. There's so many things that like can happen, when it comes down to like wrecking your voice, and it should be avoided at all costs. And like projecting is the number one thing that will help people. Doing a bit of a warm up, avoiding things that aren't good for your throat, such as like dairy and whatnot before you get ready to do a cast. Those are all good things. There's a lot of stuff that people should be aware of when they get ready to do a cast. Don't have too much citrus, you don't have a milkshake, don't have mayonnaise, yada yada yada. Anything that remotely, I don't know why I said mayonnaise. Mayonnaise isn't a dairy product. Anyway, don't have dairy products, cheese and etc. Like that can cause you to form like a mucus and a film
Right.
on your vocal cords, and you might end up coughing that up. So there's a lot of stuff that I would say, but please just God, people learn to project your voice. Don't ruin it. It's the best thing that you have if you're a play-by-play. You need it to live. You need it to make a living. So just take care of it.
Were there things you did in the past when you were younger that you sort of messed up and like had issues with?
Yeah, I'd say, like, when I got started, like I said, I was trying to overcompensate and make myself louder and more excited and whatnot, because I thought that that would make me maybe be perceived as being a better caster rather than just being responsible and taking care of myself. So there was times where, I would stop, um, projecting, and I would just be yelling, screaming from, out of my throat, and that's not good, especially when you are doing a very long finals. But, um because I kind of rectified that, this is probably, I'd say, the first year of me joining the LCK back in 2016 is when I was really having these issues. Um, but like, but if you take good care of your voice, like you can push it so much further than you might think. So luckily, like I kind of identified that I was just screaming the whole time and that I was doing damage to my voice. I was also, a smoker at that period. So like not only am I destroying my voice, I'm also just like sucking down cigarettes and whatnot, and like it was all this stuff that added up. And luckily, I was like, okay, no more of this. It's time to do things correctly. Let's do vocal warm ups in the morning before we head to the studio or before I sit down in my chair to get ready to do like an at home broadcast, whatever it may be. Do some vocal warm ups in the shower. Um, Make sure that I'm drinking and eating properly before I have a broadcast. And I just kind of got back on it, I guess. I don't know. It just kind of fell out of the routine of being prepared. I kind of just threw away all of the stuff that I learned when I was, doing acting and whatnot. But I brought it back, and now everything's fine.
Did you take any sort of classes beyond like your theater stuff you did in the past? Because I know, for instance, I think Sideshow has talked about like doing improv classes, which made sense when you were still on the on the desk, right? Did you take singing lessons or anything of the sort just to manage there?
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing, I mean, nothing beyond like when I was actively doing theater, but that all did come with doing a lot of improvisation. Like pretty much every day in high school, when I would go into my drama class, which was typically like the first thing in the morning, um, you would do, 30 minutes of improv or whatever, and you play a bunch of improv games. And that really helps build on just having quick reactions, having that, that wit that, Brian and Sideshow are so well known for. Like being quick to a joke and whatnot, being quick to jump into a situation and respond to it. It's really great, honestly. Like that's a really good thing that he brought up, and I would also recommend it immensely. Taking improvisation, it helps you go with the flow so much because like the number one rule in improvisation is you don't say no. Somebody throws a scenario at you and you just fall into it. The worst thing is that when somebody throws something at you, they like, and then it just gets shut down. That's not good. That can really break, the flow of a cast or the flow of a desk really quickly if people aren't even willing to, like, kinda pal around with that idea that you just threw at them. So, I would highly recommend doing improv. I would recommend singing as well because it will teach you how to project. It will teach you how to manage your breath. These are all things that would be really, really great, and now that you're bringing it up, I'm like, yeah, maybe I should go do that. Maybe I should find, somebody who could do some English singing lessons out here, and I should get back into that because there's always more like mastery of it that you can have. I'm not the best person at maintaining projection. I know how to do it, but I could definitely become better at it. So that's always something to keep in mind.
And that's the first part of our interview with Achilios. Now, for the second part, we're talking to him about a walk down memory lane. For him having casted Apex, of course, and then eventually coming into the Overwatch League and comparing really what the experiences of casting these games were like. We talk about him being able to cast the first match of the Shanghai Dragons, in which they won against the Boston Uprising, and the reception of that from his co-casters. We talk to him about filling dead air and the troubles there and how bad of a streak he's had in the past. And of course, we talk to him about all the Overwatch League seasons and the memorable aspects of them. If you want to stay tuned to that, hit like, subscribe, and the bell notification. For all things Overwatch with GGRecon.